Hello and welcome to this week's Hippie Hyena. So this week, something interesting popped up on my feed. A video by YouTuber Vanessa Voki RadFem, who will introduce herself in just a minute. As she's talking about something called Women Picket DC on March 8th, 2021. Hashtag Biden erased women. So let's find out what this thing is all about then, shall we?
Hi. My name's Vanessa Voki. I'm a photographer, an artist, and a sewist from Canada, and today I'm going to be making a video bringing awareness to Women's Picket DC, the protest that's happening in Washington, D.C. on March 8th, 2021. I was contacted by a member of this organization to promote this event through Instagram. They said, "I'm reaching out to you as a delegate and core organizer from the Women Picket DC protest and would like to meet with you to discuss the details of the event and see if it's something you would be interested in collaborating on or promoting. As it stands, we are a completely grassroots coalition with over 60 delegates, women of all ages, races, and political activist backgrounds from across the US. I would love to meet over Zoom." One of the reasons this person reached out to me is because I had already signed the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights.
Oh, that's a bit of an odd phrasing on that, isn't it? Sex-based rights? What does that even mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means. It's a kind of, TERF stuff. It's TERF stuff. We're dealing with TERFs today. Yes, this is another TERF episode. For those of you who don't know, TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, which is sort of a misnomer because they're not really radical, they're conservatives, and they're not really feminists. They're just people who hate trans people and try and dress it up as feminism or lefty sort of language, which is basically what the right always do. It's why the Nazis were called National Socialists. They weren't socialists, they just knew if they just called themselves outright bigots, people probably wouldn't like it. The same with TERFs. Like, you can't go around calling yourself a feminist if, you're deliberately excluding a whole bunch of females, If somebody was like, oh yeah, I definitely support women. Not black women, though. You'd be like, well, I wouldn't really call you a feminist, I'd just call you a white supremacist. The same is true of TERFs. If you're excluding trans women, you don't support women. In this regard, it's more important who you exclude than who you include, if you see what I mean.
On the Zoom call was a woman named Kara Dansky.
Kara Dansky, member of the steering committee of the Women's Human Rights Campaign.
We have been subjected to a media blackout in mainstream media. We cannot get a voice in the New York Times. We cannot get a voice in the Washington Post. We cannot get a voice on NPR.
Yeah, there's a very good reason for that, isn't there? Usually people who have incredibly abhorrent views are not invited on to talk on shows, or at least the reputable, civilized shows. You don't get your average sort of anti-Semite or just straight up racist. How often do the Ku Klux Klan get representation in the mainstream media? Pretty much never. You wouldn't really call that a sort of media blackout. It's not a blackout. It's just, why would you want to platform totally awful, hateful views? And whether you hate Jews or blacks or trans people, doesn't really make much difference. If you're going to be spreading hate, people aren't going to want to platform you.
Also, I just want to say this executive order is horrendous, and it makes a mockery of the rights, privacy, and safety of women and girls.
For those of you who don't know, all he did was make an executive order which meant you couldn't discriminate against people on the basis of their gender identity, much like you can't against people for their colour or sexual preferences or whatever. That's all. That's what's happening. Just extending equal rights to another group of people who should have had that in the first place. What it's absolutely not doing is curtailing the rights of anyone else. It's absolutely, specifically not doing that. Not doing that. That is a complete and utter lie. And what this is a kind of repackaging of the seesaw theory, which is basically this sort of far-right justification for bigotry, where the idea is that if you make things better for one group of people, it makes it worse for everyone else. It doesn't. It's nonsense. And plus, let's be clear about this. What this does is protect the rights of women. This bill specifically protects the rights of a particular group of women. So, if anything, she's arguing it does the opposite of what it does in fact do. Complete doublethink. Absolutely insane.
So, globally, for thousands of years, and in this country for hundreds of years, women and girls have been discriminated against in and excluded from civil society, all aspects of it, specifically on the basis of sex. All of the men making all of the laws for all of that time knew exactly what the word sex meant, and they deliberately kept us out because we are women and girls. And now, with the redefinition of sex to include gender identity, we are supposed to pretend that none of that exists.
No, you're not. No, literally no one is saying that at all. You're not supposed to pretend anything. In fact, what you're supposed to do is face reality, something that I'm sure you seem to have quite a lot of difficulty with. And I just want to point out, that guy on the left, that's Tucker Carlson. He's a white supremacist. He's like one of the worst people on TV, and he's inviting you onto his show. So what does that tell you about your beliefs? What does it tell you about your opinions? What does it tell the world about them? Well, it tells them that this isn't part of leftist ideology. This is not part of feminism. This is part of the alt-right. Regardless of how they try and dress it up, this is laundered neo-fascist bigotry. That's why only people like Tucker Carlson will platform these maniacs. And can I just say something which is obvious, but for some reason bears repeating? Yeah, women have had a raw deal in a lot of ways in our history, and sometimes in our present too, of course, and we should do stuff to try and fix that. But imagine if you were not only a woman, but a woman that everyone around you thought was a man. I mean, the difficulty that a person like that must go through on a daily basis is just a torment that people like me, cisgendered people like her, just could never really understand. And the just sheer gall of saying that, like, the struggle of women has been worse than that is just completely insane. It's completely insane. Based on what? What metric? What have you studied? What have you, and how does that give you the right to exclude people from the conversation? It's just, it beggars belief.
And I should also mention the Women's Declaration has been signed by 13,000 people all over the world, including 1,600 in the United States. Women are standing up. We are not having it.
When men claiming female gender identities are unable to participate in women's single-sex sporting activities, women are placed at an unfair competitive disadvantage and may be placed at increased risk of physical injury.
So crazy, so crazy. Nobody's arguing that men should be able to take part in women's sports. We're arguing that women should. Plus, who gives a shit? It's sport. Like, it's just a game. Like, increased risk of injury. What a load of old rubbish. Maybe I think that gender and sex should have nothing to do with sports. Maybe we shouldn't divide up the sports into genders at all. Like, in a weird way, that kind of seems the more sexist option, doesn't it? Like, it's kind of saying that in order for women to compete, they have to have their own special little, not quite proper version. Because implicit in that idea that women and men should compete separately is the idea that women are just worse at it. Why is gender the thing that we divide up, I mean, why not something like on the basis of the amount of testosterone that somebody has, or the amount of muscle they have, or just sort of how good they are at doing it? That probably is the best way, isn't it? If we're going to make any sort of distinction, just see how good they are at doing it, and if they're really good, put them in a category where they're against other people who are really good, and if they're not very good, maybe don't pay them to do it at all. Here's the thing. Trans women are women. They are women. So what you're in fact asking to do is to exclude a group of women from something that is a women's area. Like, why? On what basis? On what grounds? There is just literally no grounds for it. And all this sort of like idiotic notion of sex as some sort of determining factor. What are we going to do? Like, test people to see what chromosomes they've got? It's never been done before. We just allow people to join if they said that they were and looked like they were, according to our societal standards of what those genders should be. But it's all nonsense. It's like, would you be okay with them competing if they just didn't announce that they were trans and presented a lot like they were female? What if you were just never told? Like, it's just a really weird perspective. And then there are some people who think that sex shouldn't really necessarily be determined by chromosomes. It should be determined by a number of other factors, such as hormone levels, or whether the person can reproduce or not, or in which way they can. Do they have an innie or an outie? There's no, like, kind of specific, fully agreed on definitive categorization, because it's all nonsense.
And here's the thing about the 2 biological males that took the top 2 girls' medals.
Oh god, I recognise that video format. It's f***ing PragerU. Imagine that. A feminist, supposedly, sharing PragerU videos. Which goes to show the type of media that these people are consuming is not really the type of media you'd expect a left-winger or a feminist to be watching, enjoying, knowing to take clips from. It's quite something that they've had to go to this. Because really, appearing on Tucker Carlson's program and sharing clips from PragerU videos tells you more about their perspective on the world and their agenda and their belief structure than anything else they say or do. Because birds of a feather flock together.
Women and girls deserve fair and safe access to competition and access to opportunities. Biden's EO doesn't just damage women and girls' sex-based rights. It threatens children of both sexes, because both little boys and little girls are being put on puberty blockers.
Oh, Jesus, not the whole bloody puberty blockers thing again. At least they're not pretending they're given gender reassignment surgery or anything. But for God's sake, do we have to go through this every single time? Again and again, the same old urban legends. Puberty blockers are reversible. You just stop taking them, and you know what happens? Puberty. That's what happens. Basically, they're completely harmless. So, for God's sake, it's just putting off the decision till they're old enough to make it with full capacity for consent and understanding of what they're doing. That's all, for God's sake. So she said there that all she wants is women to have an equal, fair shot at competition and opportunities, which is obviously not true because she's trying to exclude a whole bunch of women. But in one sense, I kind of agree with her. I agree that maybe all women shouldn't be given opportunities. In fact, maybe not all women should be classified as women, you know? This is my solution. TERFs are no longer women. I don't categorize them as women. I think of them as men. Straight up men. And maybe, after living for a little while, having to live with society, assuming that they're men all the time, they might learn a little bit of empathy. They might learn what it's like to be constantly misgendered and how absolutely messed up that is. So, TERFs are men. That's what I've decided. Going forward, there are no female TERFs. They're all men. Keep that in mind. I hope you enjoyed this as much as you could. With peace, love, and socialism. Look after yourselves and each other.